Hello and welcome. I'm so glad to have you back with us for another session of On Book. My name is Daniela Majors-Amato. I'm the literary manager and dramaturg at the Old Globe. And on behalf of the theater staff and board and artists, I want to welcome you to our online Shakespeare Reading Club. This week, we are continuing our discussion of Henry V. One of the things I think make the history plays so exciting and to see on stage, and sometimes so difficult to read, are all of the fights and battle scenes. And I'm very excited to have a guest join us in the group today who can talk to us a little bit about that. And so here I'm going to welcome to the room fight director and choreographer Jacob Grigolia-Rosenbaum. Jacob, hi! Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Jacob credits as a fight director include Peter and the Starcatcher on Broadway and across the country, Peter Pan Live on NBC, Bloody Buddy Andrew Jackson and Cyrano de Bergerac, also both on Broadway and in earlier incarnations, as well as plays at regional theaters and touring companies across the country. Globe audiences have seen his work in last summer's Shakespeare Festival in Romeo and Juliet and As You Like It, as well as in Othello, Ken Ludwig's Robin Hood, Hamlet, and if you saw our production of The Last Goodbye, the incredible fight scenes in that production were all Jacob's work. So hello, welcome. So glad to talk to you today.
Hey, good to be here.
For audience members who maybe aren't as familiar with what a fight director does, could you talk a little bit about like your training and your role when you're working on a show?
Sure. We'll start with like what does a fight director even do, and then like to mention sort of like how I came to do that. So like a fight director's job is to make fight scenes in the live theater that are both exciting to watch and safe to do for the actors, 8 times a week or whatever the production schedule is. Which is like sort of like, I think that last point is sort of the big divide between like a stunt coordinator and a fight director for the theater, because everything has to be, safe and repeatable. And a lot of times, because runs can be months long or years long, you have to make something that everybody can learn and that understudies can be taught. So it's like excitement and safety sort of have to be sort of welded together from inception, and then also integrated into like a director's view of what the scene might actually be in their show.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a storytelling component also in terms of fights having often a big plot motivator thing. They have to move the story forward.
Absolutely. So like I would say that the main job is to make sure that sort of like the best musical numbers, like the story is constantly moving, and that every part of the fight sells something that's important to the characters, and there isn't just a lot of clang, 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 which can be exciting, but it's usually only exciting for a few seconds before people realize that they're watching some sort of static non-storytelling bit happening. So it has to be fateful and eventful as well as exciting and safe.
Is there anything unique about doing fight direction and choreography with Shakespeare's plays?
Sure. So I think the biggest thing is that there's usually very little like sort of front-loaded explanation of what the fight does, where I think, Shakespeare is famous for writing "they fight," and there's nothing else, right? There's like, it's like a little void in the text, and there's like a little blip. But what's excellent about, I would say almost every Shakespeare play I've ever worked on, this is true. I'm sure somebody in the comments can tell me if the exceptions to this. The text afterward tells you what happened. You sometimes blow for blow, right? Like, in Romeo and Juliet, there's like a detailed account of what happened in that fight where, Tybalt and Mercutio died. There's, and a lot of times in the history plays also, when there is fighting on stage, they will then, which we, we can talk about that, when there's usually some kind of a character complaining about something very specific having happened. And I would say that one little piece sort of grounds a lot of Shakespeare's fights, so that even if you'd think, oh, well, there's going to be 10,000, interpretations, there's as many different fights as there are, shows as there are directors. And to a sense, that's true. But you then also, unless you're cutting the text, there's usually some very specific reference of what happened, either immediately after or like in the scene after. And if you're not paying attention, you can miss the fact that the author actually was telling you almost exactly what has to happen in order for the fight to progress sanely.
That's so interesting. Do you have a sense historically or in the production history of the plays why that might have been the case to do it that way?
So I'm not certain. Like I think that, I mean, if my scholarship is still considered accurate, I think like back in the old days when I was learning about this, that my understanding is that the actors would be given their like sides in the script, and like everybody sort of had their own piece and no other piece of the show. And so I think when it was written, that meant that somebody was holding a description of what happened, even if they were with no extra documents. So my assumption is that just like every other part of it, it was like a cost-saving production, concern that is like still pays dividends like hundreds of years later, where you still don't need any extra book. There's nothing extra that you need to get like pretty nuanced understanding of what the original intent of the moment was, which is cool. So
it's interesting. It makes me think of something that I've heard our artistic director, Barry Edelstein, say that he finds in the text of Shakespeare throughout, is that he often finds that people will say important things 3 times.
Yeah.
Like, so that it's like, just in case somebody was yelling, somebody was throwing a peanut, somebody was in the bathroom, that he's like, you always have to hit those things 3 times. So he finds when cutting text today, you can often cut a lot of that because we have a theater audience that's actually sitting quietly and watching.
Very different. Yeah, absolutely right. That's very much the case in fights, and like it's like even if you were not present for the fight scene, you can often sometimes you'll probably be told about it later. Right? That's you probably get a discounted ticket in those days. But there you go.
There you go. Yeah. Obstructed view, just in case you missed.
I was like, what? I can hear it, but get out of the way.
Could you talk a little bit about the different types of fight work that you might be called on to do in different Shakespeare plays? Because I feel like I know that in different plays, there's like a wrestling match and As You Like It. There are fist fights. There, of course, are sword fights. And then they're like straight up like I murdered somebody. Yeah. Then you have these battle scenes. Like, seems like there's a whole lots of different types of fights that you can be called on to do, even in a single play. Yeah, no,
I mean, I would say that I think that the same thing that makes sort of Shakespeare still relevant today is true in both the themes and the text as it is in the fight scenes, and that the fights are sort of run the whole gamut of the human experience of why do humans why are they violent with one another, and what is the cost of that violence, and all of that is, I think, really, really baked into a lot of Shakespeare's sort of biggest shows, and it's definitely everything. And I would say for especially for the histories and the tragedies, the violence is sweeping in its variety, where you'll get like Richard II, there's a huge buildup to an enormous honor duel at the beginning that never happens, right? And so the audience is primed and then primed again, and you're like, we are going to see some guys in armor fighting on the stage, man, and you never see that. And then the show ends with a terrible personal murder that is as far away from that honor duel as possible, but still totally personal and very and informs a lot of who Richard really was, to the point that the murderer in that play is shamed for having just had that fight scene, and it pivots the whole like he is transformed by what the evil deed that he just did right at the end of that play, which sort of starts off that whole tetralogy or whatever. And so like I think that that like hyper, the only thing you certainly see in that one is this hyper personal, very awful, not, it's like it's not exciting, it's just horrible from, you know, start to finish, and people are getting hit by axes or whatever is implied in the text. It's awful, right? And then you have like you know, real like amazing athletic duels that might be like laced with clever lines, like in you know, Romeo and Juliet, and of course that then explodes. Like you again, you think you're going to see something honorable and exciting and athletic, and then of course that sort of in one play deteriorates into a horrific catastrophe. So I think as much violence and excitement with that violence that Shakespeare freights into his shows, I think very few of them don't have a take on violence in general that sort of, you know, that you know, whether you're looking for it or not, is I think there, having done a lot of these things, that I think a lot of times there's the excitement is there, the fights are often there, but then there's often some, you know, like the realism of it comes in usually at the end, even in comedies and stuff.
That's so interesting. In terms of history plays, you kind of alluded to the fact that often we're not seeing on stage these giant battles that we are hearing advertised in prologues and described in some detail. And I you know, I kind of went through Henry V, and I don't know if that's a play you're very familiar with in particular. Oh, okay, great. So I went through and I was like trying to sort of track, you know, when things were happening on stage or described to happen on stage, and when they were sort of happening off stage. And you know, the on stage fighting seems slim.
Is there any? Yeah, no, Henry V, and how could it be more different than Henry IV? Again, if you guys haven't looked at that recently, when you're looking at Henry V, excuse me, it's there's all of this implied, like the scale of the violence is in very much like it's war scale, where it's like this impersonal mass violence is talked about and described in great detail. And what I love is that I would say, unless you happen to be a theater that's affiliated with an MFA program that has a good fight school,
I'm like raising
you know
our
what
hand.
I'm saying, right? You probably wouldn't be in the position to stage anything, right? And like, and the chorus in Henry V very specifically is like, well, obviously we can't show you anything because we have these 5 like rusty rapiers or something. That's not the word that the chorus used, but it's something like, or 5 dented you know, rapiers. So obviously we can't show you any of this stuff, but imagine that that's horses, and imagine that that's 1,000 person is 1,000 people, and you'll get close to what we're talking about. And so I would say that an institution like the Globe, for example, is one of few that might actually be in a position to do something more without, you know, being unable to produce a show again after that, right? But I mean, I think one of the sort of glories of the theater is the ability to perform the magic that the course describes, which is, and I think what they're saying is in that is not, we're not going to show anything to you, but what we are going to show you is just a placeholder that your mind must enlarge. And so I would say in many cases, in Henry V specifically, and in the other Henrys, the earlier ones, you know, 4-1 and 4-2, that the battles are not necessarily meant to be skipped, but which they often are. But that there's some, you know, is there some dumb show? Is there some choreographic element that is even alluded to in the chorus of Henry V that the audience would have seen as scene, change action, where people are coming in and you see people running in and on, and then in come the people who are speaking. And I think many times people will add some kind of gloss to suggest what the fight is. But honestly, like sometimes it's just sound, and people come running in from the sound of some guys hitting swords together off stage, and there you go.
Would you talk maybe a little bit about like in shows you've worked on it, and are you creating the gloss? Is this part of your fight direction that you're creating? Because I do find that even going back through the text again, like you see aftermaths, right? You see sort of like people maybe someone dragging a body on, or you know what I mean? You see like a moment of stillness in the midst of something where people run to a quiet location to sort of like talk. I wonder if you could talk more about like what are the kinds of things that go into creating those moments, or how do you create the sense that something bigger is happening off stage and that we're watching something that's happening on stage?
Absolutely. So I would say that like even the structure of Shakespeare's shows sort of suggests what you might do, which is what you were just describing, which is like there's something that the people must exit from into this moment of quiet. And is there like how much can you get away with creating that is actually happening that won't wreck the audience's imagination of the scale? Right? Because you don't want to make something that's small and real to destroy somebody's vision of a whole battle in their mind, right? So it's, and I would say that theatrical stage combat is always in that dance of like, what do you show that's can be like visceral or amazing or funny that doesn't detract from the like extra stuff that a theater goer is sort of putting onto the show with their imagination without even thinking about. Because I mean, sort of theatricality in general is sort of always requests that of us. And so as a fight choreographer, I would say that it's entirely dependent on the style of the show. So, right, like Barry, for example, doesn't love seeing a lot of extra stage combat in a show. I'm not going to say universally, but having worked with him a couple of times, that's like as one example. And so while some directors are like, well, I want to see like, people and fighting, and I want it to be like brutal, and I want people to be like, oh my God. And then the scene starts. And so those two directors would wind up with two very different 3-second glosses at the beginning of thing, where like if you're like, okay, so the words you just used were this, so you can have as many actors as you can spare who are not in the following scene in a very specific way, put helmets on them so they don't look like the character they are, like there's a lot of tricks to expand the size of an ensemble in a big fight scene. And then you see what their ability is. I think to sort of answer earlier questions, like how do you approach fight choreography, by answering this is everything. It's not only dependent on the sort of the vision of the director and the specific style of that specific production that you have to do while you're trying to advance the plot, but you also have to really be in dialogue with the actors who you're working with, and their specific physical capacities. And I would say that one of the things that I think every single show in my career, you go in with like an imagination of like, you've spoken with a director and you plotted out all of like what might be. And then you have to find out whether the actors can do that. Do they have like, where there was one of them just in a car accident and they have to be really careful with their back for the whole run of the show? Like, like, is there somebody who's like a super gymnast and you thought you were going to have some boring fight, but then it turns out they can actually run up walls? Like that more than once, because it's, we work in a magical industry where people are magical. But so I think that like part of the answer, it's not just what does the director want and then see what you can do that gets the audience there in a beautiful way, but it's like, how can these actors with that director do that right now, and then 7 more times a week forever.
Sure. Well, that's a very collaborative and company-based way of creating work, which I'm sure is very similar to what Shakespeare would have done with his own company, in terms of like creating work that these people could do together. I'm interested in this piece because a couple of things. I mean, I feel like in Henry V specifically, we have a lot of violence that is described but not seen. I mean, like nasty violence, like burn all the prisoners. We have the like idea where the French come into the camp and kill the children. And when we have the one boy who we ourselves have been following throughout, who I think, I mean, I as a reader kind of assume he's maybe killed in that. You know what I mean? You don't know really exactly what's happened to that particular boy. So I'm wondering if, I feel like there are ways in which just like transitions in a play really help storytelling, whether fight in these instances can be used to either create different types of like, what kind of world are we experiencing in terms of understand what I'm kind of getting at in terms of like how much are we experiencing the violence of the world? And are we just sort of like hearing about it, or are we finding some ways to actually take it in or see the aftermath of it?
So that's another thing where the audience's tastes and the director's ability to interpret that or like decide what that taste might be really drives that, because like specifically with those scenes with the murder or the throat slitting of all the captives and the French sort of like unlawful murder of all the camp boys in this thing are these atrocities at the end of this fight that sort of fuel the sort of like the rage and like sort of Henry's final scene when like sort of like, so basically if you don't show them or if you don't in some way interpret them, man, you got to cut a lot of that scene or find some way through it that's makes sense to everybody sitting in the audience. And it's, I think usually there's something shown, especially because not only do we have the boy, but there's also a French prisoner who we see in the text of the show, right? So like we've met the victims of both of these atrocities in the show under other, in other scenes in ways that we didn't realize had any kind of like tragic import, like as they were sort of moving through it. I think again, this is sort of like the same sort of slick answer, but like what you see would be entirely dictated by what the director was looking to show. And I would say that if it was like a downtown New York production, you would wind up seeing every person murdered, you know what I'm saying? And there'd be like blood everywhere. But that like generally, I would say like you don't, it might be some I'm thinking of some of my favorite like, stuff in like, the Royal Shakespeare or something, where they're pretty good at some of the productions I've seen over the years have like done glosses on moments like that, even in like the Scottish play or whatever, where you see like the massacre of the innocent in a way that's really horrible, but that isn't like some rated R thing. And I would say that it usually is something like that, where you see some representative carrying out of that fact.
Or I guess you could just like bring on the boy's hat.
Right. That is representative. Exactly.
As we narrate it, we just hand you his hat, so we know he's dead and we feel the feelings.
That's exactly it. And it's like, do you want it to be possible for the youngest member of the audience to miss it? Yeah. And in many cases, the answer is yes, most certainly. So, it depends on that.
Well, as somebody who once got forced to play one of Macduff's not in the script children just to get murdered.
So sorry.
I've lost scenes myself where they can be pretty brutal.
Yeah.
Once going back through the text, I think it's interesting that the one time in the play where like you get like an act of violence described in those little miniature stage directions, like he strikes him, isn't I think the stage direction Henry V? It's like Williams and Gower, where Henry has planted this glove to sort of create a false fight. Yeah. So oddly, it's just odd that the only onstage sort of like thing that's described on in the page as a text, as a fight, is like a comic fight in a way, like a throwback to his time as Hal and Henry IV.
I feel there's a couple of little pieces. There's like the his old companions. There's some other stuff that's implied, stuff of like got people dragging each other out of fights. And I would say it's still probably likely that a fight director would be like, even if somebody was doing a version of the show where there was nothing other than the text, and like if it doesn't say they fight, we're not fighting, you'd still probably wind up with the fight director coming in to consult over he strikes him and over the sort of physicality of the people not fighting, right? Like in those those earlier scenes, and that would be it for Henry V. It would be it could be as little as that. Where it's a gauntlet. It's people grabbing hold me back in the beginning, but I would say that usually there's a choreographic element that comes into the final bit so that it doesn't just really feel very texty at the end. It's a lot of guys entering with great drama, wearing hopefully some kind of something.
Some kind of
wearing a chain. I was like, well, probably not. Depends on the production.
Well, it's interesting because this conversation is making me think that obviously we've got these history plays which are very much about epic battles and epic shifts in political power and mass scale, death and destruction. But what we're really focusing on is human story and the human response to that, and the way that we process it, and the way that we force people to go into it, and the impact it has on us when we come out of it. And it makes me actually a little bit like skeptical of these big film adaptations where you really are spending so much of your on-screen time actually watching these battles unfold. It feels like a very different balance of what the play is engaged with and dealing with.
Profoundly agree, right? Like I think that the biggest thing that you can say about the sort of the arc of all of the violence in and again, it's like someone I think the devil's advocate to what we're about to say here is that Shakespeare was constrained by company size and cost and no special effects and all of the things that he writes right there in the text, but at the same time that limitation, as limitations so often do, created a space where he was forced to focus on things that mattered, which was like human, as you said, the human cost and the individual price that all of these characters pay for the violence that they are trading in. And I feel that very much that's the sort of the moral of a lot of the plays or not the moral, but the show is the travel through that cost and through the person's experience, and that's why we still do it. So.
Fascinating. As we're sort of coming to a close, I want to encourage folks who are watching to please ask your questions in the chat. We can see them. I am pulling up on the screen one of the comments here that was made. This is Susie Parker, I think. Reminds me of the Asian plays done recently that have very stylized violence. And I think there are a lot of different cultures that have that use violence on stage not in a very literal way. I don't know if I'm sure you do a lot of work with fight that is not sort of literal or bloody or in that very.
Yep. I've even sort of strangely done some plays in a sort of like some Japanese style violence, um, and the and it doesn't, you know, it is culture non-specific, what I'm about to say, which is that uh, I think every theatrical culture sort of has to grapple with how do you incorporate war into the stories that people tell, especially because so much of a lot of stories that people tell are about sort of big moments in history where things changed a lot. Um, and are you still with me? Hold on.
Yep, we can see you and hear you. Have we lost
I
me?
just feel like everything froze, and there was a big like thing. Would you like to save changes? And I was like, oh, the internet. Here we go. Uh,
You're still
yeah,
with
no,
us.
yeah, still. So I would say that yeah, everybody grapples with like how do you humanize these moments of, you know, huge change in a way that people can still understand the story you're telling. Like how do you do Agincourt? You know, how do you
Yeah.
do Sekigahara or whatever, right? It's like he's somehow, I was about to say, get those puppets out, or, you know,
Yep.
get the
Yep.
shadows out. And I think a play that I was working on for the last couple of months, which is on pause now, thankfully not permanently canceled, knock wood, um, was a show that had a lot of sort of different tools to show violence like this, and like shadow play and puppets were used throughout. And then you'd have like puppets like coming in, like real people would come in and interact with the puppets after they stopped being shadows, and then you'd have like an actual sword fight between people sort of on stage. So it's everything. Use it all.
Oh, it's very interesting. Well, it's, I feel like we find ways to feel these big things. I feel like I can't feel when I watch a battle scene in a movie. I can't necessarily feel the thing because it's just so big. Whereas sometimes like you see somebody get their finger slammed in a door and you're like, oh,
10 times worse. Yeah, 10 times worse.
You can feel it so deeply. So trying to find a way for us to feel these things without getting overwhelmed. Partly limitations of theater, partly this way of us experiencing in a small way a thing that's big, so that we can actually have an access to it in some way.
There's something that the thing that you just referenced is actually one of the sort of most it's like sort of it's the fulcrum in like all stage combat, actually, which is the division between violence that people understand because they've felt it, and violence that people understand because they've been told stories about it before. And oftentimes sword fighting is totally foreign and fantastical, and like it's very even if there's a sword fighting is visceral and oh my god, that looks brutal and terrible, it still is in some other world that people don't connect to in a very different way than if somebody like hits their finger with a hammer. And everybody in the whole audience, if you have something small like that happen, waves of like empathetic pain will like, you'll see a whole theater of hundreds of people go into like defense mode when you hear like the hammer drop on the table or something like that. And coming in and out of that relationship that people have to their own like pain or something is like one of the tricks that fight choreographers use to keep people in. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Well, do you have, as we close, any tips for us from your perspective in terms of reading these plays, especially history plays or plays that have a lot of these battle techniques, or things that maybe techniques that you use, or maybe gifts from your perspective you could share?
Yeah, so what's funny is like I'm so far down the rabbit hole of this thing. I was like, oh, just watch with like your imagination and this thing. And I was like, yeah, but my own imagination is so suffused with this that I'm like, oh yeah, of course, it's this battle of these things and no problem. I mean, I feel that if you've never ever looked at like what the the weapons or whatever of that time might be, I feel the history plays are a great time to spend 2 minutes doing a Google search and taking a look. because some of the like vocabulary, specifically in that the sort of the Henry, 4 and 5 with Richard, like that tetralogy, it's like they're talking about really specific problems that suddenly make a lot of sense when you understand what they're talking about. Like, when there's a bit where somebody talks about like Henry, Henry V, like jumping onto a horse, and like, why is that? That doesn't matter. But what they're saying is that he jumped onto a horse while wearing all this stuff. And the reason it's something that people are like, holy smokes, he jumped onto a horse, is because like, that's impossible. Like, he was wearing 80 pounds of stuff, man. And so like, I mean, I would say if you want to get into the details, take a second to look, take a look at the recent Netflix, show that at least has some great costume bits for this similar story, and like that'll give you a sense of what it is. And then I think other than that little hint, I think just give your mind the highest budget possible and read.
Thank you. I love that. Really appreciate your humane perspective on violence from someone who spends their life choreographing it.
Absolutely. That's like, it gets it all out of the system.
And thank you for inviting me to now spend the next 2 hours on the Wikipedia looking at weaponry. So thanks. Wikipedia rabbit hole unlocked. Okay. Thank you again, Jacob. And thanks everybody for joining us. And we will be back with you next week. Bye-bye.